Officer Dale Kesler stops 17-year-old Elijah Marsh outside the public library, mocking him for carrying law books he can't understand, in front of a small crowd. Elijah stays calm. A courthouse hearing is only days away that no one in the crowd knows about yet. Hours earlier, we learn Elijah has spent 2 years teaching himself criminal procedure after his older brother was wrongfully convicted based on a coerced confession. His late grandfather's Warren Law Dictionary, annotated in the margins, is the emotional object tying him to why this fight matters. The stop happens outside the county courthouse annex and public library on a busy afternoon. Commuters, students, a coffee cart, security cameras on the building, a bus stop crowd who all become witnesses. Kesler searches Elijah's bag at random, reads the book titles aloud mockingly, implies Elijah must be planning something or playing lawyer, and makes him sit on the curb while a small crowd watches and does nothing. We learn this is Kesler's fourth stop of a black teenager near that same courthouse in 2 months, each one logged as field interview, with no complaint ever going anywhere, including one against Elijah's own brother that started the same way. Ms. Pruitt, the reference librarian who's watched Elijah study every day for a year, steps outside and quietly tells him she's kept records of every time Kesler has done this near her library, and that she finally has somewhere to send them. Kesler, irritated that Elijah won't get angry or beg, cuffs him for his own safety and calls it into dispatch as a possible loitering with intent stop, ignoring Elijah's calm request to simply call his court-appointed advocate. Body camera footage, Ms. Pruitt's library log, a text thread with Elijah's brother's public defender, and an old complaint file against Kesler that was quietly closed the same week his brother's case was assigned to the same precinct all start stacking toward one conclusion. Judge Vivian Okafor, presiding over Elijah's brother's post-conviction hearing that same week, arrives at the precinct in person after hearing about the stop, having already reviewed unrelated evidence that connects Kesler's name to the case she's been quietly investigating. In the courtroom days later, Elijah, allowed to speak as a witness because of his own legal research, asks Kesler one precise procedural question about his brother's original arrest that Kesler cannot truthfully answer without exposing his own coerced confession tactics, unraveling the case live. Kesler's badge is formally removed on the judge's order pending investigation. His prior field interview pattern becomes part of a department review, and Elijah's brother's conviction is vacated. Months later, Elijah's brother is home. Elijah has a scholarship to study pre-law. Ms. Pruitt's library log becomes part of a city oversight reform, and Elijah keeps his grandfather's dictionary on his new desk. Ends with a reflective question and call to action. What's a kid like you doing with books like this? Planning something? Officer Dale Kesler held up the worn hardcover in one hand, turning it so the small crowd gathered near the courthouse steps could read the title for themselves: Criminal Procedure and the Rights of the Accused. He said it the way a man says something he thinks is funny, loud enough to draw eyes, quiet enough to pretend later he hadn't meant anything by it. Elijah Marsh stood with his backpack unzipped and emptied onto the pavement beside him, 17 years old, still in his school uniform, and did not answer right away. He looked at the book in the officer's hand the way someone looks at something precious being handled carelessly. "I'm studying," he said finally. His voice was steady. "For school." "Studying," Kesler repeated, and a couple of people near the bus stop laughed. Not unkindly exactly, just the easy laughter of people who'd rather be entertained than uncomfortable. "You look a little young to be studying law, son, unless you're planning on needing it." "I might," Elijah said. "One day." "That's kind of the point." Kesler didn't like the answer. Men like him rarely liked answers that didn't flinch. He tossed the book back into the open bag, not gently, and gestured for Elijah to sit down on the curb while he ran his ID, though nothing about the stop had ever needed to go that far. Elijah sat. He kept his hands where the officer could see them, the same way he'd been taught to since he was old enough to understand why it mattered. And he watched the small crowd of commuters and students drift past without a single one of them stopping to ask why a 17-year-old was being searched on a public sidewalk for the crime of carrying books. Nobody in that crowd knew that in 4 days, Elijah Marsh would be standing in a courtroom 2 blocks from where he now sat, asking a single question that would end Dale Kesler's career. They had no idea who they had just humiliated. 2 years earlier, Elijah's older brother Terrence had been arrested outside a corner store 3 blocks from their apartment, accused of a robbery he hadn't committed. He was 19 at the time, working 2 jobs, saving for community college. The arresting officers questioned him for 6 hours without a parent or lawyer present. And by the end of it, exhausted and frightened in a way Elijah still couldn't fully picture without his stomach tightening, Terrence had signed a statement he barely understood, admitting to something the evidence would later suggest he hadn't actually done. Their court-appointed public defender was overworked and underprepared. The trial lasted 4 days. Terrence was convicted and sentenced to 8 years. Elijah was 15 when it happened. He remembered, more than anything, the helpless feeling of watching adults in a courtroom make decisions about his brother's life using words he didn't understand, procedures he couldn't follow, rules that seemed designed to be understood only by the people already inside the system. He decided, somewhere in that helplessness, that he would never feel that powerless again. He started at the public library the following month, working through a stack of used law textbooks his grandfather had left behind. A retired shop teacher who'd never practiced law a day in his life but had, for reasons Elijah never fully understood until years later, kept a battered legal dictionary on his shelf, its margins filled with careful handwritten notes in blue ink. Know the rules better than the people enforcing them, his grandfather had written on the inside cover, years before Elijah was even born. It's the only fair fight left. Elijah carried that dictionary in his bag every single day for 2 years, alongside whatever new procedure manual or case law summary he was working through that month. He wasn't trying to become a lawyer overnight. He was trying to understand exactly what had happened to his brother, procedure by procedure, until he could explain it back to anyone who asked. He had an appointment that week he hadn't told anyone about yet, a chance, finally, after 2 years of filed motions and quiet persistence from a new attorney who'd taken Terrence's case pro bono, to testify at a post-conviction hearing that might reopen everything. He'd been reading that morning, one last time, through the exact procedural rules governing his brother's original arrest, when Officer Kesler stopped him outside the library doors. The courthouse annex sat at the center of downtown's busiest corner, its limestone steps worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, flanked on one side by the public library and on the other by a coffee cart that did steady business with the lawyers, clerks, and jury pool members who moved through the block all day. Security cameras lined the building's exterior, angled toward the entrances, though few people ever thought to wonder what they actually captured on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. At 4 in the afternoon, the sidewalk filled with commuters heading toward the bus stop, students cutting through on their way home, court employees finishing their shifts. It was the kind of public, busy corner where a person might reasonably assume nothing too unfair could happen without someone noticing. That assumption, Elijah had learned 2 years earlier, was not something he could afford to trust anymore. The precinct that patrolled this corner had a station only 4 blocks away, and officers rotated through the courthouse beat regularly, partly for court security, partly, unofficially, to keep an eye on who came and went from the library and the public benches nearby. Benches where teenagers without much money to spend elsewhere tended to gather after school. Elijah had walked this exact stretch of sidewalk almost every day for 2 years without incident. He told himself, without quite admitting he needed to, that being quiet, being polite, being visibly focused on his books instead of his phone, was its own kind of protection. That afternoon would teach him otherwise. Kesler crouched down slightly, close enough that Elijah could smell the coffee on his breath, and picked through the contents of the emptied backpack with 2 fingers, like he was handling something unpleasant. Criminal procedure, he read aloud again, holding up a second book. Constitutional rights of the accused. He glanced up, smirking at a co-worker who'd wandered over from the coffee cart to watch. Kid's got a whole legal library back here. What are you, planning your defense in advance? I have a brother in prison, Elijah said quietly. I'm trying to understand what happened to him. Sure you are, Kesler said, not unkindly exactly, but not believing him either, the particular tone of a man who has already decided what kind of person is standing in front of him and doesn't intend to be talked out of it. He held up Elijah's grandfather's dictionary, the cover soft with age, the spine cracked from years of use. This yours? It was my grandfather's, Elijah said. Please be careful with it. Kesler tossed it back into the open bag without answering, harder than the others, and one of the loose, annotated pages slipped free, drifting onto the pavement. Elijah reached for it instinctively before catching himself, freezing halfway to his knees, unsure if the movement itself might be read as some kind of threat. A woman near the bus stop had her phone out, filming, though she didn't say anything either. A man in a suit walking past slowed his steps for a moment, glanced at the scene, then kept walking, adjusting his tie as though the sight made him uncomfortable in a way he'd rather not examine. Elijah stayed exactly where he was, hands visible, voice level. Am I being detained, officer, or am I free to go? Kesler's smirk faded slightly at the phrasing. It wasn't the question a scared kid usually asked. That small detail would become the first crack in his entire story. This was not, though the small crowd on the sidewalk had no way of knowing it, an isolated afternoon. Records that would surface later showed Officer Kesler had logged 4 field interviews of black teenagers near this exact courthouse corner over the previous 2 months, each one initiated on vague grounds, suspicious loitering, matched a general description, appeared nervous, and each one closed without further action, without a single formal complaint ever making it past the precinct's internal review desk. One of those 4 stops, though no one connected it yet, had taken place 18 months earlier and involved Terrence Marsh, weeks before his arrest, an encounter that never made it into the official case file at all. A public defender's office 3 blocks away kept its own informal log, the kind overworked attorneys sometimes maintain not because anyone asked them to, but because patterns become visible eventually if enough people are paying attention. Kesler's name appeared in that log more than once, always in connection with young black men near the courthouse, always with complaints that seemed to evaporate somewhere between being filed and being reviewed. None of that history was visible on the sidewalk that afternoon. What was visible was a 17-year-old boy sitting on a curb with his grandfather's dictionary scattered at his feet, answering a police officer's questions with more precision and calm than the officer clearly expected, while a small crowd of witnesses watched and did nothing at all. That, too, was a pattern. It was simply a quieter one. Miss Pruitt had watched the whole thing unfold from the library's front window, and she did not hesitate the way the rest of the crowd had. She was the reference librarian who'd known Elijah for nearly 2 years, who'd helped him track down half the case law summaries in his backpack, who'd quietly set aside a study corral near the reference desk that had become, without either of them ever formally arranging it, Elijah's spot. She stepped outside, phone already in hand, and did not raise her voice, but made sure her presence was unmistakable, standing close enough that Kesler had to acknowledge her. "Officer," she said, "I've been the reference librarian at this branch for 6 years. I've watched that young man study in my library nearly every day for the past 2 years. I'd like your badge number for my records, please." Kesler's expression flickered, the first small sign of irritation breaking through his composure. "This isn't your concern, ma'am. It became my concern the moment it happened outside my library," Ms. Pruitt said evenly. She looked down at Elijah, her voice softening only slightly. "I've kept a log, you know. Every time this has happened near my doors. I never had anywhere useful to send it before." She glanced back up at Kesler. "I think I finally do." Kesler didn't respond to that directly. He straightened, adjusted his belt, and decided, in the particular way certain men decide things when they feel a situation slipping slightly out of their control, that the conversation needed to end on his terms instead. "I'm going to need you to stand up," he told Elijah. "We're going to do this properly." He had no idea the file was already on its way. What happened next took less than 90 seconds, though it would be replayed, dissected, and referenced in formal proceedings for months afterward. Kesler cuffed Elijah's wrists, explaining to the gathering crowd that it was standard procedure for everyone's safety during an ongoing field interview, though nothing about a calm 17-year-old sitting quietly on a curb had required that escalation. He called it into dispatch as a possible loitering with intent stop near a government building, language that would sound, to anyone reviewing the report later without context, considerably more serious than a boy reading library books on a public sidewalk. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He simply said, clearly enough for the small crowd and Ms. Pruitt's phone camera to catch, "I'd like to call my attorney. My brother's public defender's office has my emergency contact information on file. I have a court date this week, and I need you to understand that." Kesler paused, just slightly, at the word attorney. "You have a lawyer?" "My brother does," Elijah said. "I've been helping with his case. That's what those books are for. I wasn't planning anything, officer. I was studying for the exact reason I told you the first time. Somewhere behind the library's front desk, Ms. Pruitt had already begun forwarding 2 years of dated log entries, along with the video she'd just recorded, to an email address she'd been given only the week before by a public defender's paralegal who'd come by looking for exactly this kind of record. The mistake was not what Kesler had said on that sidewalk. The mistake was who he had said it to, and how many people, finally, were watching closely enough to remember it. By the time Elijah's release paperwork cleared the precinct desk 2 hours later, no charges, the loitering with intent language quietly downgraded to a field interview note once a shift supervisor reviewed the situation. A small, careful stack of evidence had already begun assembling itself in places Kesler had no visibility into. Ms. Pruitt's 2-year log of stops near her library, cross-referenced against precinct patrol schedules, showed Kesler's name attached to every single incident. Body camera footage, requested formally by the public defender's office the following morning, captured the entire encounter clearly, including Elijah's calm, precise questions and Kesler's increasingly defensive answers. A closed internal complaint file, buried the same week Terrence Marsh's case had first been assigned to the precinct 18 months earlier, resurfaced when a records clerk, prompted by the new request, happened to notice the overlapping dates. 2 mini-twists emerged within days. First, the original complaint against Kesler, filed by a different family entirely, had been closed not for lack of evidence, but because the assigned reviewing officer at the time was Kesler's own training supervisor. Second, and more damning, a note buried in Terrence Marsh's original arrest file, one his overworked original public defender had apparently never fully reviewed, referenced an earlier field contact with Kesler that had never been disclosed during the trial. None of it was public yet, but it was no longer buried either, and the person now reviewing all of it quietly from her chambers 3 blocks away was someone who had spent the last several weeks already asking uncomfortable questions about Terrence Marsh's original conviction. Judge Vivian Okafor had been presiding over Terrence Marsh's post-conviction hearing for 3 weeks by the time she heard about the incident outside the library. She had already, independently, flagged inconsistencies in the original arrest report that troubled her enough to request additional records from the precinct. Records that, once cross-referenced against Ms. Pruitt's newly forwarded log and the reopened complaint file, connected in ways that made the coincidence of Elijah's sidewalk stop impossible to ignore. She arrived at the precinct in person the following morning, unannounced, a decision her clerk later admitted was unusual enough to make the desk sergeant visibly nervous. The doors opened. Footsteps crossed the tile floor with a measured, unhurried authority that made every officer in the front room straighten slightly without quite understanding why. The room, mid-conversation, went quiet. Kesler, filling out paperwork at a nearby desk, looked up and recognized her immediately. The judge presiding over the very case his name had just resurfaced in. His expression didn't change dramatically, not yet, but something in his posture did, the particular stiffness of a man recalculating how much trouble he might actually be in. "Officer Kesler," Judge Okafor said, "I have some questions for you. I'd prefer to ask them somewhere more appropriate than a precinct lobby. I'll see you and your captain in my chambers this afternoon." She did not raise her voice either. She didn't need to. The room had already begun to shift around her, the way rooms do when the person walking through the door carries more weight than anyone standing in it. 4 days later, Elijah Marsh sat in the witness section of Judge Okafor's courtroom, not as a defendant, not as a bystander, but as a witness the judge had, in an unusual but fully permissible ruling, allowed to submit questions during his brother's post-conviction hearing, given his direct, documented involvement in compiling procedural research relevant to the original arrest. Dale Kesler sat at the front of the courtroom in dress uniform, his captain beside him, his earlier confidence considerably thinner than it had been on the sidewalk 4 days before. Elijah's attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Renata Blackwood who had taken Terrence's case pro bono 18 months earlier, guided Elijah through a short series of procedural questions about the timeline of his brother's original arrest. Questions built directly from the case law research Elijah had spent 2 years compiling in the exact books Kesler had mocked outside the library. "Officer Kesler," Elijah said finally, his voice steady in a courtroom that had gone very still. "On the night of my brother's arrest, your report states he was read his rights at 11:47 p.m., prior to questioning beginning. But the interrogation room's own time-stamped equipment log, which the defense subpoenaed this week, shows questioning beginning at 9:52 p.m. Can you explain the 2-hour gap between when questioning actually began and when your report says his rights were read? The courtroom held its breath. Kesler opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at his captain, who did not look back at him. Kesler started. There may have been some informal conversation before the formal interview began. That wouldn't have required 2 hours of questioning my brother, a 19-year-old with no prior record, without reading him his rights. Is an informal conversation, officer, Elijah said quietly without triumph, only precision. That's exactly the procedural violation my grandfather's law dictionary describes on page 211. I read it enough times to know it by heart. The room you thought belonged to him didn't anymore. In 10 minutes, Kesler had learned that lesson completely. Judge Okafor did not need to deliberate long. The 2-hour interrogation gap, combined with body camera footage from the library stop showing a clear pattern of targeted, unjustified field interviews, combined with the buried complaint file and the training supervisor who had improperly closed it, formed a picture too consistent to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. Officer Kesler, Judge Okafor said, her voice calm, formal, and absolutely final. I am ordering the immediate suspension of your badge and duties, effective today, pending a full departmental and prosecutorial investigation into the conduct surrounding Terrence Marsh's original arrest, as well as the pattern of stops identified in the library log submitted this week. Kesler's captain, sitting beside him, did not object. He had already seen enough of the file that morning to understand exactly how little ground there was left to defend. I was doing my job, Kesler said quietly, more to himself than to the room. I was following procedure. Procedure, Judge Okafor said, requires reading a 19-year-old his rights before 2 hours of questioning, not after. It requires documenting field interviews honestly, not selectively. This young man in front of you understood that requirement better than you did, officer, and he learned it from library books you mocked him for carrying. The courtroom, for the first time in the entire hearing, allowed itself to exhale. Somewhere near the back, Miss Pruitt, who had come to watch, pressed a hand briefly to her mouth. 2 weeks later, based on the combined weight of the interrogation timeline and the newly reviewed complaint pattern, Judge Okafor formally vacated Terrence Marsh's conviction, ordering his immediate release pending the district attorney's decision on retrial. Terrence Marsh walked out of the county correctional facility on a bright Tuesday morning, 18 months after Elijah had first opened his grandfather's dictionary determined to understand exactly what had happened to him. Their mother was waiting at the gate, and so was Elijah, holding, without quite planning to, the same worn dictionary that had started the whole slow, patient unraveling. The department's internal review, prompted by Judge Okafor's order and Ms. Pruitt's 2 years of careful documentation, expanded within a month to examine every field interview Kesler had logged over the previous 3 years. 2 other families, having heard about the hearing through local news coverage, came forward with similar stories, similar dismissed complaints, similar patterns quietly buried by the same overburdened review process. Kesler resigned before the department could formally terminate him, a detail the local paper noted without much sympathy. The captain who'd sat beside him in court retired earlier than planned, under pressure from a city council suddenly very interested in precinct oversight reform. Ms. Pruitt's library log became, unexpectedly, a template the city council adopted for a new civilian oversight initiative, requiring public institutions near high-traffic government buildings to maintain documented incident logs available to review boards on request. She still keeps Elijah's study Corel exactly as it was, though these days he doesn't need it as often. 6 months later, Elijah Marsh sat at a small desk in his family's new apartment, a partial pre-law scholarship letter pinned to the wall above him. His grandfather's law dictionary sitting open on the corner of the desk, its cracked spine held together now with careful tape. Terrence had found steady work at a warehouse 2 towns over, taking night classes toward the associate's degree he'd been forced to abandon 2 years earlier. Their mother had stopped flinching, Elijah noticed, every time a patrol car passed slowly on their street, though it had taken months. Ms. Pruitt still worked the reference desk most afternoons, and Elijah still stopped by sometimes, not to study anymore quite so urgently, but out of habit and gratitude, and the quiet comfort of a place that had believed him before most of the world was willing to. He kept his grandfather's dictionary close, the annotation on the inside cover as legible as ever. Know the rules better than the people enforcing them. It's the only fair fight left. Elijah had added a line of his own beneath it, in his own handwriting now, blue ink to match. And sometimes, that's enough to win it. Have you ever watched someone underestimated simply because of how they looked or what they were carrying, and wondered what it would take for the world to finally listen to them? Drop your answer in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more real justice stories.